On the tired, cracked streets of Atlanta's South Side, where dreams often withered beneath the weight of unpaid bills and forgotten promises, the Carter family fought a quiet, relentless battle against poverty and hopelessness. Monique Carter, a woman whose hands bore the calluses of 1,000 unpaid hours and whose eyes carried the weight of too many nights spent awake, had spent the last 14 years raising her sons, Jaden and Malik, alone, against a world that seemed determined to grind them into the dust. Every morning before the sun dared to rise, Monique scrubbed office floors for men who would never remember her name, rushed across town to sling plates of greasy diner food under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, then spent her nights hunched behind the bulletproof glass of a grimy gas station, counting every minute until sunrise. Every aching muscle, every unpaid overtime shift, every humiliating encounter was fueled by a single, ferocious hope that her boys could have a life bigger than the broken neighborhood they were born into. Jaden, her firstborn, was different from the start. A boy who looked at the sky like it held all the answers, who spent his afternoons poring over library books about aviation, building model planes from scraps of cardboard and glue, and stealing minutes on battered public computers to practice flight simulators so complex they made grown men curse and quit. Malik, 2 years younger and far more impulsive, wasn't as obsessed with planes, but he believed in Jaden like religion, convinced that if his brother said he could fly, he could probably touch the stars. For 3 endless years, Monique hoarded every dollar she could save. She skipped lunches, bought no new clothes, walked miles to avoid bus fares, living like a ghost in her own life, invisible and determined. And finally, when her body was worn thin and her spirit bruised but not broken, she held in her trembling hands 3 one-way tickets to Los Angeles, a city she barely knew, a place she imagined as a land of endless work and second chances, somewhere her boys could finally stretch their wings. Their apartment, once cluttered with memories of scraped-by birthdays and second-hand Christmases, stood hollow now, emptied of everything but hope and necessity. As they rode the battered city bus to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, with nothing but 2 stuffed duffel bags and the clothes on their backs, the streets of Atlanta unspooled outside the foggy windows, crumbling sidewalks, boarded-up stores, graffiti-streaked brick walls fading into the distance, and Monique silently vowed never to bring her sons back to this life of dead ends. Jaden sat rigidly by the window, his mind soaring miles above the cracked concrete, envisioning cockpits and runways and roaring engines, while Malik leaned against him, half asleep but grinning, mumbling, "You gonna fly us there yourself, Captain J?" And Monique, in that rare, perfect sliver of a moment, allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, all the years of struggle and sacrifice were about to pay off. The terminal buzzed with life when they arrived. People rushing, announcements blaring overhead, bright lights reflecting off polished floors. And for a family who had spent their lives feeling invisible, it was dizzying and strange to be part of something so vast. None of them knew that beyond the gleaming glass gates and endless corridors, destiny was waiting, coiled and patient. None of them knew that today, against every possible odd, Jaden and Malik Carter would be called to do the impossible. Not for themselves alone, but for hundreds of lives suspended thousands of feet above the earth, with nothing between survival and disaster but 2 boys whose hearts were too stubborn to surrender. The airport seemed to stretch forever, a gleaming maze of polished marble floors, towering glass walls, and endless corridors that made Jaden, Malik, and Monique feel like tiny ants lost in a kingdom of giants. But there was wonder too, tucked inside the nervousness. Every flashing departure board, every echo of suitcase wheels on tile, every distant roar of a jet engine promised escape, promised possibility. Monique gripped her son's hands tightly as they passed through security, her knuckles whitening with the effort not to show her fear. She had never flown before, had never trusted anything that soared so far beyond her control. But for her boys, for the chance at something better, she would have strapped herself to the wings if she had to. Jaden, wide-eyed but trying to look composed, couldn't stop staring at the giant windows where gleaming planes taxied across runways like metal beasts, each one whispering the same siren song. freedom, future, sky. Malik, bouncing at his side, teased him endlessly, nudging him with his elbow, joking that Jaden probably already knew how to fly better than half the pilots here. But Jaden only smiled thinly, his mind too full of technical readouts and flight checklists, imagining systems and controls beyond those locked cockpit doors. Their flight, American skies. Flight 237 was scheduled to board in less than an hour, and every second felt stretched tight with anticipation. Monique kept checking their boarding passes, double-checking the gate number, her heart hammering against her ribs with a kind of raw, trembling hope she hadn't let herself feel in years. They found seats near their gate, slumping onto the hard chairs, surrounded by the low murmur of travelers and the faint smell of airport coffee and hot pretzels. Around them, businessmen in sleek suits barked into phones, families wrangled cranky toddlers, and teenagers lounged with backpacks slung over their knees. But the Carters sat quietly, drinking it all in, clutching their few possessions as if the future itself could be stolen from their hands if they weren't careful enough. A voice crackled overhead announcing pre-boarding for Flight 237, and Malik whooped loud enough to make a few heads turn, unbothered by the stares. Jaden grinned despite himself, tension bleeding away for just a moment. As they lined up at the gate, showing their IDs and scanning their crumpled boarding passes, Monique leaned down and whispered fiercely into Jaden's ear, "No matter what happens, baby, remember, you are meant for more than this world has ever given you." Her voice trembled with emotion she couldn't quite hide, and Jaden, blinking fast to keep from tearing up, nodded solemnly. The jet bridge felt endless as they walked down it, the air growing thicker, heavier with the metallic tang of recycled air and jet fuel. And then suddenly there it was, the plane that would carry them out of everything they had ever known, its massive silver body gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The logo of American Skies painted boldly on its side like a promise they were desperate to believe in. As they boarded, Jaden brushed his fingers against the doorway frame, a superstitious little habit he'd picked up from old pilot memoirs, whispering a silent prayer he wasn't even sure he believed in. Let this bird fly true. They found their seats near the middle of the plane, Monique in the aisle, Malik by the window, Jaden sandwiched between them. Seatbelts clicked, overhead bins slammed shut. Flight attendants bustled down the aisles with practiced smiles. And somewhere far ahead in the sacred hidden world of the cockpit, Captain Thomas Miller and co-pilot Andrew Scott prepared to carry 200 souls into the sky, unaware that fate had already written a different flight plan. As the engines roared to life, a low, bone-deep vibration shuddered through the plane, and Jaden felt his pulse quicken, not from fear, but from awe. This was it, the moment he had imagined 1,000 times, the border between earth and sky, between the past they were leaving behind and the future still waiting, unwritten and bright and terrifying. He turned to Malik, who was plastered to the window already grinning like a fool, and then to Monique, who smiled through 1,000 silent prayers she dared not say aloud. And in that electric heartbeat between wheels and wind, Jaden Carter closed his eyes, tightened his fists, and silently promised, "Whatever happens up there, I will not let my family fall." Sure to like this video, subscribe for more real stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep the fight for justice alive. The plane rumbled beneath them, a living, breathing thing coming to life, as Jaden gripped the armrests and leaned slightly forward, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure Malik could hear it over the low hum of engines building power. Around them, passengers shuffled in their seats, checked their phones, flipped through magazines they wouldn't really read. But Jaden was locked in, every nerve attuned to the ship that now held their fate. The flight attendants, Vanessa Brooks among them, her crisp uniform immaculate, her smile warm but sharp, moved swiftly through the aisles, giving safety instructions that most passengers ignored. But Jaden listened with a kind of hungry focus, committing every word to memory, silently ticking off the procedures he'd studied so many nights in the faint glow of a borrowed laptop screen. Malik elbowed him again, whispering, "Relax, Captain. You're not flying this one." "Not yet," with a crooked grin, and Jaden managed a chuckle, but it was half-hearted. The plane was taxiing now, turning slowly toward the runway, and Jaden's mind was already racing through the takeoff checklist he knew so well. Flaps, throttle, V1 speed, rotation, climb out. From his seat, he could just barely glimpse the cockpit door, closed and locked, a barrier between passengers and the mystery of command. But he imagined the pilots behind it, hands steady, eyes sharp, running through final checks with the easy confidence of men born to own the sky. The plane paused at the runway threshold, engines roaring like caged beasts. And for a moment, Jaden could feel the tension ripple through the cabin, a collective inhalation held tight in every chest. Then with a sudden, violent surge, they were rolling, the acceleration pinning him back against his seat, the tires screaming across the asphalt, faster and faster until the whole world seemed to blur. And then lift. The moment of liftoff hit like a punch and a kiss all at once, a stomach-dropping rush as the earth fell away and the sky opened up to swallow them whole. Malek whooped and pressed his face to the window, watching Atlanta shrink below them into a patchwork quilt of lights and shadows, and Monique squeezed both her boys' hands tightly, her knuckles white, her lips moving in a silent prayer that no turbulence, no disaster would drag them back down. Jaden barely breathed, heart hammering in his chest, eyes wide, feeling every dip and sway of the plane, memorizing it, cataloging it. Pitch, yaw, roll, he thought, feeling the movements he had studied so often now alive under his skin. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and a few passengers unbuckled immediately, stretching cramped legs, pulling laptops from bags, pretending at casualness. But Jaden stayed strapped in, hyper-aware of every noise, the faint hydraulic whine of flaps adjusting, the rumble of retracted landing gear, the steady reassuring drone of the engines. Up here, he realized, there was a kind of sacredness between the blue-black heaven and the glittering earth, a space where human hands and human hearts had to trust in each other completely. And Jaden loved it, loved the sheer terrifying wonder of it. Malik nudged him again, pointing at the seatback screen with the live flight map displayed. A tiny cartoon plane slowly crawling westward across the country toward Los Angeles, toward a new life. And Jaden smiled at his brother's excitement, but deep down, something inside him stayed tightly coiled, an instinct he couldn't shake. He told himself it was just nerves, just the hugeness of the moment. But still he kept glancing toward the cockpit door, watching, waiting, feeling a prickle along the back of his neck. Over the intercom, Captain Miller's voice crackled, steady, professional, with a calm, southern drawl, welcoming everyone aboard, assuring them of smooth skies ahead, thanking them for flying American skies. Jaden listened carefully, noting the slight breathlessness in the captain's voice. "Abri, catch that didn't seem quite right." But before he could think more about it, Malik was tugging at his sleeve, showing him a snack menu and debating whether peanut butter pretzels or trail mix was the superior mid-air snack, and Monique, laughing softly, promised she'd splurge on whatever they wanted, because today was the start of everything new. For a little while, Jaden let himself believe it, that this flight was nothing but a bridge to their future, that the years of struggle were behind them, that the sky, for once, would be kind. But deep in his chest, the coil of instinct remained, tightening slowly, silently, as above the clouds, far from safety, destiny waited just out of sight, its hand poised to turn a routine flight into a desperate battle for survival. For nearly an hour, Flight 237 cruised smoothly above the patchwork fields of Georgia and Alabama, gliding effortlessly through the crisp blue sky at 35,000 feet, while inside the cabin, life settled into a hum of quiet normalcy. Passengers dozed under thin blankets, flipped through half-read books, and flicked lazily through in-flight entertainment, lulled into the false security of routine. But Jaden, ever watchful, never let his mind drift too far from the machinery beneath them, his ears picking up every change in engine pitch, every subtle vibration of the airframe, until somewhere deep in the bones of the plane, he felt it, a shudder almost too soft to notice, like a ripple running against the grain of the air. At first it was easy to dismiss, a patch of rough air, a gust. But then the seatbelt sign dinged back on, and the calm voice of Vanessa Brooks came over the intercom, requesting all passengers to return to their seats and fasten their belts. And Jaden's stomach twisted with a sudden, sharp certainty that this wasn't ordinary turbulence. The plane jolted again, harder this time, a sudden drop that made several passengers gasp aloud, and Malik clutched the armrest so tightly his knuckles went white, while Monique instinctively reached across to steady both her boys. Her face tight with fear she fought to hide. The plane shook once more, violently now, drinks sloshing out of cups, overhead bins rattling ominously, and the easy, lazy atmosphere shattered into crackling tension as people looked around wide-eyed, murmuring anxiously, scanning the cabin for answers that weren't coming. Jaden's heart pounded, adrenaline surging through his veins as he fought to stay calm, forcing himself to think logically, to remember everything he had ever read about turbulence procedures. But even as he ran the checklists in his mind, he noticed something far worse. The flight attendants were whispering urgently near the galley, their faces pale, glancing toward the cockpit. And that's when Jaden knew. It wasn't just the weather. Minutes stretched into forever as the turbulence eased slightly, but a thick, unnatural silence settled over the cabin. The kind of silence that screams that something is terribly, horribly wrong. Jaden strained his ears, waiting for an announcement from the cockpit, a reassuring voice telling them everything was under control. But none came. Malik, his voice a harsh whisper, said, "Bro, why is it so quiet?" And Jaden had no answer, only the sick, lurching certainty blooming in his chest. Then came the final crack. The flight attendants, usually a model of calm professionalism, started moving faster, their voices sharper, one of them pounding lightly on the cockpit door, then harder when there was no response. Panic flickered from row to row like wildfire, as people twisted in their seats, looking at one another with wide, frightened eyes. Passengers standing up despite the buckled-in warnings, a woman clutching a baby crying out, an older man demanding to know what was happening. In the chaos, Jaden saw Vanessa step back from the cockpit door, her face stricken as she grabbed the in-flight phone to call someone, anyone. But the line crackled uselessly, communication down. Outside the windows, the clear blue sky mocked them, endless and empty. Suddenly the plane dipped hard, not from turbulence, but from something else. An uncontrolled loss of altitude, a deadweight fall that sent drinks flying, passengers screaming, Malik yelling Jaden's name as trays crashed, and the plane's nose angled downward in a way no train pilot would ever allow. Overhead compartments burst open, bags and jackets spilling into the aisles, and Jaden felt his own body lift slightly from his seat even with the belt straining tight. The unmistakable sensation of a freefall stealing the breath from his lungs. People screamed. Prayers filled the air. Someone shouted, "We're crashing." And in that split second of pure chaos, Jaden made a decision that would change all their lives. He unbuckled his belt with shaking fingers, ignoring Monique's panicked cries to stay put, grabbing Malik's hand and dragging him toward the front of the plane with a purpose burning brighter than fear. He didn't know what he could do. He only knew that he had to try, because somewhere beyond that locked cockpit door, the people meant to guide them safely home had already fallen. And if someone didn't act soon, they would all fall with them, a blazing fireball raining from the sky. The cabin had become a raw, screaming storm of terror, a tidal wave of pure human panic crashing against the thin aluminum walls meant to keep them safe. And as Jaden and Malik shoved their way forward, dodging bags tumbling into the aisles and passengers flailing in blind fear, the scene around them spiraled into something almost surreal. An elderly woman sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. A businessman in a navy suit barking into a dead cell phone as if yelling louder could force a signal to appear. A teenage girl screaming for her mother even though they sat side by side. Everywhere, people clawed at seat backs, at each other, fighting for some illusion of control in a sky that had suddenly turned cruel. Monique, trying to follow her sons, was pushed backward by a wave of bodies, her voice lost in the chaos. And Jaden, heart pounding, knew that every second they wasted arguing or panicking was another second closer to the ground rushing up to meet them. Near the front rows, a tall, broad-shouldered man, Sean Davidson, shoved past a pair of terrified teenagers, his face twisted with rage and fear, grabbing at a flight attendant and snarling, "Get that damn door open! Where the hell are the pilots?" His voice boomed through the cabin, amplifying the hysteria, and others took up the cry, shouting demands, banging fists against the walls, the ceiling, the cockpit door, as if noise alone could will salvation into existence. Vanessa Brooks, white-faced but still fighting to hold authority, stood her ground near the cockpit, hands raised, shouting for calm, but her words were drowned out by the furious, panicked mob mentality taking root among the passengers. One man tried to shoulder his way to the cockpit door, rattling the handle, but it refused to budge. It was locked, sealed from the inside, and whoever was behind it was beyond help now. Jaden's mind raced faster than his feet, calculating, analyzing, desperate for a plan. He grabbed Malik by the wrist, pulling him aside into a narrow space near the galley, whispering fiercely, "We have to get in there. We have to take the controls." Malik stared at him like he'd lost his mind, but there was trust there too, deep and unshakable, the kind only brothers forged in the fires of hard lives. Meanwhile, the plane continued its slow, deadly descent, the sensation of falling almost constant now, stomachs floating, ears popping, the engines no longer singing with strength, but droning unevenly, as if even the heart of the machine was faltering. Somewhere in the chaos, a mother with a toddler clutched her child tighter, sobbing prayers under her breath, and a man in a baseball cap vomited into a paper bag, his face sheet white. Jaden forced his way to Vanessa, tugging on her sleeve, shouting over the noise, "I can fly it! I know how to stabilize it!" She stared down at him, at first seeing only a terrified kid like any other, but something in Jaden's eyes, something steely, something certain, made her hesitate, even as Sean Davidson stormed toward them, pointing an accusing finger. "You letting a damn kid fly us now?" he roared, face red with fury, spittle flying from his mouth, and others turned toward them, faces twisted with fear and anger, demanding to know what was going on. For a moment, the entire fate of Flight 237 hung on the razor-thin thread of Vanessa's decision, her gaze flickering between the howling mob and the boy standing stubbornly before her, daring her to believe in the impossible. Another lurch rocked the plane, a gut-wrenching tilt that sent a food cart careening down the aisle, and someone screamed that they were going to die, but Jaden didn't flinch. He just stood there, fists clenched, trembling not with fear but with urgency. Malik at his side, both of them battered by a life that had prepared them for moments just like this. Moments where you didn't wait for permission, you acted. Finally, with a sharp breath like a diver plunging into dark water, Vanessa nodded and yanked open the emergency cockpit override, her hands trembling, her voice low and urgent. "Okay, kid, prove it. Save us." And with that, the dam broke. Jaden and Malik slipped past her into the sacred space beyond, the heavy door swinging shut behind them, cutting off the roar of terrified passengers, leaving them alone in the cockpit with two unconscious men, a wall of blinking, screaming instruments, and a wounded bird falling from the sky with nothing between salvation and doom, but two boys who had never once been taught to give up. Sure to like this video, subscribe for more real stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep the fight for justice alive. The cockpit door slammed shut behind them with a heavy metallic click, sealing Jaden and Malik inside a world they had only ever dreamed of. But there was no time to marvel or hesitate. The air smelled wrong, sharp with the tang of burnt plastic and something even more sinister. A faint chemical bite that Jaden instinctively knew shouldn't be there. And at their feet, sprawled in unnatural angles, were the bodies of Captain Miller and co-pilot Scott. Their faces slack, skin alarmingly pale, oxygen masks dangling uselessly from above as alarms shrieked and screens blinked warnings in angry, relentless red. For one terrifying heartbeat, Jaden froze, the full impossibility of the situation crashing down on him. He was 14 years old, standing in the beating heart of a falling giant, with no license, no uniform, no right to be here except for the fact that no one else could save them. Malik, voice shaking, asked, "Jay, what do we do?" And somehow that snapped Jaden back to himself. He grabbed his brother's shoulder hard, grounding them both, forcing his voice to stay steady as he said, We're gonna fly this thing, just like we practiced, just like the simulators. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from 1,000 invisible hours taking over as he dropped into the captain's seat, the leather still warm from the man who should have been sitting there. He scanned the control panels with a rapid, practiced eye. The main attitude indicator spinning slightly, altitude falling fast, autopilot disconnected, engines still functional, but losing thrust, and a cold, clinical calm settled over him, the same feeling he used to get when everything was falling apart at home, and he had to stay strong for Malik and their mom. First step, stabilize the plane. Jaden's fingers danced across the throttle levers, easing them gently back to correct the speed, while his other hand adjusted the yoke, feeling the heavy resistance of a plane that didn't want to obey, that was hurt and confused and scared, just like its passengers. "I need comms, I need radio," he barked to Malik, who scrambled to the co-pilot's seat, pushing aside the slumped, unconscious body of Andrew Scott and fumbling with the headset until Jaden snapped, "Channel 1, emergency frequency," and Malik, pale but focused, obeyed. Static hissed in Jaden's ear for a terrible moment before a voice crackled through. Female, calm, professional. "This is Atlanta Center. Flight 237. We see you losing altitude. Respond." Relief surged through Jaden so hard it made him dizzy, but he forced himself to keep steady, keying the mic with trembling fingers. "Atlanta Center, this is Flight 237. Both pilots unconscious. Cabin crew incapacitated. I am unlicensed personnel assuming control, requesting immediate guidance." There was a stunned silence, a pause long enough to make Jaden's heart stumble, and then the voice returned, sharper now, controlled panic barely hidden beneath professionalism. "Copy that. Flight 237. Identify yourself." Jaden glanced at Malik, who stared at him like he was waiting for the answer too, and with a courage he didn't even know he had, Jaden replied, "Jaden Carter, 14 years old. I've trained on flight simulators. I can fly it. Please tell me what to do." Another pause, an eternity, and then the woman's voice came back, stronger, decisive. "Jaden, listen to me. We're going to get you through this. First, stabilize your descent." It was happening. It was real. No time to doubt, no time to cry, no time to think about how impossible it all was. Around them, the cockpit blazed with warnings: overspeed, altitude drop, terrain alarms screaming as the ground raced closer. But Jaden blocked it out, breathing slow and deep the way he'd taught himself when he panicked during late-night study sessions, forcing his mind to narrow into the task at hand. Fly the plane, save his brother, save his mother, save every single soul buckled in behind him depending on a boy no one had ever planned to trust. Malik called out readings, altitude, speed, horizon, and Jaden worked the controls, steady hands on the trembling yoke, his small frame straining against the raw power of the aircraft fighting him every inch. Outside the cockpit window, the endless blue sky was tilting, the horizon a slashing line of cloud and light. But inside, Jaden Carter sat tall, a boy who had never flown a real plane in his life, now cradling hundreds of lives in his calloused, determined hands. And with each heartbeat, each tiny correction of pitch and throttle, he whispered fiercely in his mind, "I will not let us fall. I will not." And somewhere deep inside the crippled plane, it seemed, the bird heard him and started to listen. Jaden's fingers moved with the desperate precision of a boy standing on the thin, fraying line between survival and disaster, the cockpit around him alive with a chaotic symphony of flashing lights, shrieking alarms, and the low, desperate growl of engines straining to obey a crippled ship's dying commands. And every second counted. Every tiny mistake could mean fire and screaming metal raining down from the sky. His headset crackled again as the air traffic controller's voice, Lisa Harper, he would learn later, guided him through emergency protocols, her voice steady but laced with an urgency that pushed him harder. "Jaden, check your trim settings. Bring your nose up. Ease back. Gentle. Don't yank it. Feel the plane. Talk to her." Talk to her. Jaden almost laughed. a hollow, breathless sound caught in his throat, because he already was. He whispered under his breath like a prayer, coaxing the wounded machine back into balance, feeling the heavy vibrations through the yoke, sensing when she fought him and when she yielded. Malik, sweating bullets but laser-focused, read off the digital displays from the co-pilot's side, calling out altitude, 23,000 feet and falling, airspeed, 300 and dropping, vertical speed, -2,000, bro, we're diving still. And Jayden adjusted accordingly, muscles trembling from the effort of wrestling the massive plane back under control. Outside the windshield, the earth was too close, details sharpening from distant blur to terrible clarity. Highways, clusters of houses, shining rivers, threading through dark patches of forest. And Jayden knew they didn't have time for long explanations or slow decisions. Lisa's voice cut through the panic again. Jayden, listen. I'm pulling up a route to the nearest safe landing strip. We're going to get you down. Her words felt like a lifeline thrown across a roaring sea, but even as he clung to them, new alarms erupted. Engine 2, lower thrust warning, cabin altitude warning. A sinking feeling hollowed out Jayden's gut. The carbon monoxide leak, he realized. The pilots hadn't just fainted, they were poisoned, and maybe others were breathing it too, the whole cabin filling with invisible death. He couldn't think about that now. One problem at a time. Keep the bird flying, find the ground, get them down alive. The autopilot controls flickered back to life for a moment, and Lisa guided him through resetting it. A delicate balance of buttons and switches that Jayden executed with hands he had once trained by drawing systems, diagrams over and over in a battered notebook because he couldn't afford real simulators. When the autopilot caught for a few blessed minutes, stabilizing their speed and pitch, Jayden almost cried with relief, slumping back against the seat just long enough to catch his breath. Malik whooped, punching the air, but Jayden shook his head sharply. This wasn't over. The plane was heavy, damaged, bleeding altitude like a stuck artery. Jay, look! Malik pointed wide-eyed at one of the monitors. A thunderstorm cell brewing ahead, massive and boiling with dark clouds, a monster waiting to tear them apart if they stayed on their current heading. Jayden's pulse spiked. He slammed the manual controls back into action, disengaging the autopilot, ignoring the shrill protests of the warning systems. Terrain, pull up, and muscled the plane into a slow banking turn. The fuselage groaning in protest, passengers screaming behind the locked cockpit door as gravity yanked at them sideways. Lisa's voice came hard and fast. Good job, Jayden. Keep banking left, avoid the storm. You're doing great. You're keeping them alive. He clung to those words like armor, like fuel, locking every doubt and every fear into a dark box inside him because there was no room for it now. Malik kept him grounded, shouting encouragement, feeding him readings, working the flaps and controls he could reach, the two of them operating like a single desperate mind, brothers bound not just by blood, but by survival itself. In the brief seconds between instructions, Jayden saw flashes of his mother's face in his mind, not the exhausted, beaten-down Monique of endless night shifts, but the fierce, proud woman who had told him he was meant for more. And he realized with a burning certainty that no matter what else happened, he would not let her die in the sky she had given everything to reach. Not today, not ever. And so Jayden Carter, 14 years old, born of struggle, baptized by fire, flew the broken bird through the thinning sky, a tiny figure seated at the controls of 200 lives and the fragile, furious hope that maybe, just maybe, he could bring them all home. The autopilot, strained beyond its limits by the battered systems and the brutal forces battering Flight 237, finally gave a last shudder and died, its small blinking light winking out with a cruel finality that left Jayden gripping the controls with both hands, fully manual, fully raw, nothing between them and the raging sky but his own stubborn will. The plane rocked violently as winds whipped across its broad wings, dragging it left and right like a toy in the hands of giants, and Jayden had to fight every inch of the way, the yoke jerking in his hands, the engines rumbling with a dangerous, uneven cough. "We lost autopilot!" Malik shouted over the rising noise, his voice thin and high with fear. But Jaden just gritted his teeth, locking his arms, adjusting the throttles manually, feeling the heavy resistance that screamed how damaged the bird really was. Lisa's voice was still in his ear, tight and urgent, feeding him instructions. But even she couldn't mask the fear creeping into her tone now. This wasn't just a rough landing anymore. This was a dying plane in the hands of a boy whose only experience was digital screens and secondhand manuals. Jaden, listen, you need to slow your descent. Watch your vertical speed. Pull up, ease her back. You can do this, kid. The storm front loomed ahead, a monstrous wall of black clouds and greenish lightning that flickered like the breath of some angry god. And Jaden knew that if they punched through it without control, they'd break apart in seconds, metal torn like paper, screams swallowed by the roaring heavens. No way, not today. Not with his mother sitting terrified just rows behind him, not with Malik depending on him, not with all those lives trusting, unknowingly, that somewhere up front, a kid had refused to quit. He adjusted the flaps, fighting the jerky, sluggish response, easing the plane into a desperate climb to skirt the worst of the storm, the engines roaring in protest as they clawed for altitude. The altimeter spun wildly, the ground too close, the wind shear slamming them sideways with bone-jarring force, and for a moment Jaden thought the wings would shear clean off. But he gritted his teeth, hands locked in place, riding the bucking monster with the grim focus of a rider breaking an unbroken stallion. Malik, hands sweaty but steady, shouted readings over the roar, flipping switches when Jaden barked orders, the two boys moving in frantic, perfect coordination. A brotherhood stronger than the storm, stronger than fear. Behind them, the passengers screamed and prayed and held on to their seats as the plane rocked and tilted. But Jaden couldn't spare a thought for them now. All he saw was the artificial horizon on the instrument panel, the trembling pitch and roll indicators, the struggling engines in his mind's eye. A warning light flared, fuel imbalance, and Jaden snapped orders at Malik to cross-feed, managing the bleeding systems as best they could. Every movement instinctive, every second dragging them closer to either salvation or disaster. "You're doing it, Jaden," Lisa's voice said, quieter now, filled with awe, and Jaden almost dared to believe it. But the plane was still dropping, still too fast, too steep, and ahead the storm wall opened its jaws wider. He pulled harder on the yoke, gritting his teeth until they hurt, feeling the nose inch up against the screaming protest of aerodynamics and broken hydraulics. Lightning flashed so close he could see the bones of Malik's hand for a split second, and the plane rolled hard left. Jaden corrected instantly, muscles screaming, fighting the instinct to panic, knowing that even a second of hesitation could doom them. The altimeter ticked up, 30 seconds more, maybe a minute, and the worst of the turbulence eased, like a hand releasing its grip on the fuselage, the battered birds staggering back into more stable air. Jaden and Malik gasped for breath, soaked in sweat, muscles quivering, but still holding the line. Ahead, far off, but blessedly visible on the navigation screen, was a flat patch of land. The emergency landing strip Lisa had directed them toward, a small regional airport barely equipped for a jet this size, but their only hope. Jaden adjusted their course manually, a painstaking inch-by-inch battle, and whispered to himself under his breath, a prayer, a command, a promise all at once. "We're gonna land this. We're gonna make it. Hold together, baby, hold together." And somehow, impossibly, the wounded giant answered him. Flight 237 shuddered, groaned, but obeyed, clawing through the last of the storm's ragged edges and into the thin, fragile light beyond, where life and earth and hope waited if only Jaden Carter could finish what he had begun. Even as the storm faded behind them, the battle for Flight 237 was far from over, and Jaden knew it deep in his bones, because now every system in the plane felt ragged and unstable, every vibration a threat, every flicker on the control panels a potential death sentence. Alarms still blinked relentlessly, warning of low fuel, engine strain, hydraulic pressure dropping, and the weight of 200 desperate lives pressed down on Jaden's narrow shoulders with the force of a collapsing sky. The emergency landing field Lisa Harper had guided him toward glowed like a tiny patch of salvation on the navigation screen. But it was still 20 long, aching miles away, and the plane was bleeding altitude faster than Jaden could safely control. He fought the yoke with both hands, arms locked, sweat pouring into his eyes, feeling the jet respond sluggishly, like a wounded animal dragging itself home. "We're losing her, bro," Malik shouted, over the rising howl of the wind through the battered fuselage, and for the first time, real fear flickered across his face. But Jaden only shook his head, jaw clenched so hard it ached, voice low and fierce as he rasped, "Not yet, not until we land." But behind the thin cockpit door, fear had festered into full-blown hysteria among the passengers. Sean Davidson, the angry businessman, had rallied a small group of terrified men to storm the cockpit, convinced that putting their lives in the hands of two boys was suicide, that something, anything had to be done to take control. They pounded on the cockpit door, shouted threats, demands, their voices bleeding through the walls like a rising tide of chaos. And Jaden's hands shook for a fraction of a second on the yoke, because he knew, if they broke through, if they distracted him even for a moment, the plane would tip, stall, spin, and there wouldn't be time to recover. Lisa's voice was back in his headset, urgent. "Jaden, ignore them. Focus. You are the captain now." He squeezed the yoke tighter, grounding himself in her words, in Malik's unwavering trust beside him, in the memory of his mother's worn hands holding his when he was small, telling him he could be anything, even when the world screamed he couldn't. Ahead, the landing strip was coming into view, a thin gray thread carved into the green fields. And Jaden's heart twisted with a new fear. The strip looked small, far too small for a jetliner this size, and there were no visible arrestor beds, no emergency barriers. It wasn't built for wide-body planes. It was built for small, propeller-driven aircraft. But it was all they had. "We're too heavy," Jaden realized aloud, horror seizing him. The plane was still fully loaded with fuel meant for Los Angeles, and even with the turbulence and battle through the storm, they hadn't burned enough to lighten safely for a landing this short. The brakes alone might not be enough to stop them. "Dump the fuel!" Lisa barked into the headset, reading his thoughts, and Malik, bless him, was already scrambling to find the right switches, hands shaking but steady, pulling the emergency fuel dump levers as Jaden fought to keep the plane level. A dull whoosh reverberated through the cabin as precious, deadly weight began bleeding from the wings. But it would take precious minutes to lighten enough, and they didn't have minutes. Behind them, the pounding on the door intensified. The mob wasn't calming down, and Sean Davidson's hoarse, furious voice cut through the noise, shouting that they were going to crash because of some stupid kids pretending to be heroes. Jaden's muscles screamed as he fought a sudden crosswind. The battered plane buffeted sideways, wheels and wings straining against the forces ripping at them, and for the first time he tasted real despair at the back of his throat. But then Malik shouted, "Look!" and pointed through the windshield, and there on the strip, lights were flashing, emergency crews already waiting, fire engines lining the edges, a dozen vehicles ready to race to their rescue. They were not alone. Jaden swallowed the lump rising in his throat, squared his shoulders, and said to Malik, steady and certain, "We're bringing her down, no matter what." His voice left no room for doubt. He keyed the intercom to the cabin for the first time, cutting through the chaos with a calm he didn't feel. "This is your acting captain speaking. Brace positions. Right now." Behind the door, a stunned silence fell, as if even the angriest, most terrified passengers felt the conviction in his voice, the unbreakable will that refused to let go. Malik grabbed the landing gear controls, and with a lurch and grinding whine, the wheels dropped into place, locking imperfectly, a half-broken prayer whispered in metal and hydraulics. Jaden checked everything one last time. Flaps extended, speed just barely within safe limits, approach lined up, and then, with a deep, shaking breath, he pushed the nose down, committing Flight 237 to its final descent. The battered bird screaming toward the ground, toward life or death, with a boy and his brother at the helm, carrying the hopes and fears of everyone aboard into the most important landing of their lives. Sure to like this video, subscribe for more real stories, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps keep the fight for justice alive. The final approach felt like stepping into a battlefield with no armor, the plane groaning and shuddering under Jaden's control as he guided the wounded giant lower, lower, the thin gray ribbon of the emergency runway growing larger through the cracked, storm-streaked windshield, every nerve in his body stretched to the snapping point. The world outside seemed to blur into a tunnel, nothing existing except the strip of tarmac ahead, the altimeter bleeding numbers too fast, and the breathless, terrifying certainty that there would be no second chances. Lisa's voice in his ear counted down in clipped, urgent bursts. Altitude 1,000 feet, 900, 8. And Jaden adjusted the flaps, feeling the whole bird shudder as they bit into the rushing air, trying to slow their screaming descent without tearing the wings off. Malik braced himself beside him, his small hands steady on the backup controls. Both boys locked into a silent, furious communion with the machine that refused to die. Behind them, the cabin was eerily silent now, the passengers hunched in brace positions, prayers whispered in every language, strangers clinging to strangers. No more anger, no more panic. Only the primal instinct to survive and the thin, trembling hope that someone, anyone, could deliver them from the jaws of death. Jaden could feel the plane resisting him, the bulk of it groaning with each adjustment like a living thing in pain, the wheels vibrating through the deck as the landing gear fought to hold steady against the rising turbulence of ground effect. The airspeed indicators flickered dangerously, too fast for a safe landing, but if he dropped too much speed now, they would stall and fall short of the runway. No choice but to ride the edge. "Flare at the last second, Jaden," Lisa coached urgently, but Jaden barely heard her anymore. He was deep inside that quiet, burning place inside himself, the place he had found long ago when he was a little kid, patching holes in a leaky apartment roof while his mother cried in the other room. The place where quitting simply wasn't an option because no one else was coming to save them. The runway rushed toward them, impossibly narrow, lined with flashing emergency vehicles like a gauntlet of last hopes. And Jaden felt Malik's hand clutch his sleeve, a grounding touch that said without words, "I believe in you." 50 feet above the ground now, engines idling low, the tires barely clearing the trees at the end of the field. 30 feet, 20, and Jaden, gritting his teeth so hard they hurt, pulled back gently on the yoke, coaxing the plane's nose up in a shallow flare, just as the wheels kissed the concrete with a brutal, jarring slam that rattled every bolt in the frame. Tires screeched, brakes screamed. The cabin was filled with the deafening roar of reverse thrusters kicking in, the fuselage shuddering violently as Jaden wrestled the yoke to keep the plane straight down the narrow, unfamiliar strip. The end of the runway loomed closer and closer. Too fast, and for a terrifying moment he thought they would overshoot, crash through the fence and into the open fields beyond. But Malik, thinking faster than fear, slammed the emergency brake lever with all his strength, and the plane jolted so hard it felt like they had hit a wall, the nose dipping, the wheels smoking, passengers crying out, Malik shouting something wordless and fierce. And then, by a miracle Jaden would never fully understand, the plane skidded, strained, and at last shuddered to a final, quaking stop, just feet from the end of the tarmac. For a few infinite seconds there was only silence, broken only by the ticking and groaning of cooling metal, the distant wail of sirens racing toward them, and the soft, raw gasps of two boys who had wrestled death out of the sky and won. Jaden slumped back in the pilot's chair, hands falling away from the yoke, his entire body shaking so hard he thought he might fall apart. But Malik grabbed him, laughing and sobbing at the same time, shouting, "You did it, Jay! You freaking did it!" And somewhere behind them, the cabin exploded into cheers, cries, prayers, the sound of 200 people waking up to the impossible fact that they were alive. The cockpit door burst open and Vanessa Brooks stumbled in, her face streaked with tears, falling to her knees to hug them both. And even Sean Davidson, the angry man who had doubted them, stood in the aisle staring stunned and silent, at the boys who had saved them all. Outside, the emergency crews surrounded the plane, flashing lights filling the cabin with a kaleidoscope of color, firefighters readying stairs, medics rushing forward. But inside, Jayden closed his eyes for one brief, blessed moment and let the weight fall off his shoulders, knowing in the deepest part of his heart that no matter what anyone ever said again, no matter how big the world seemed, he had flown into the storm and brought his family, his people, home safe. The chaos after the landing felt almost dreamlike, a whirlwind of flashing lights, shouting voices, and rushing footsteps blurring together as Jayden, Malik, and Monique were swept from the battered plane into the humid afternoon air, surrounded by firefighters, paramedics, airline officials, and a sea of news cameras that seemed to materialize from nowhere, their lenses gleaming hungrily as they captured the story unfolding. The story of two boys who had dragged a broken jetliner from the sky and planted it safely back onto the earth. Jayden stumbled down the stairs first, his legs trembling so badly he thought they would collapse beneath him. But Malik was right there, steadying him, both boys wide-eyed and blinking against the sunlight after so long locked in the storm. Monique raced toward them, pushing past the emergency workers, throwing her arms around both her sons in a fierce, crushing hug, sobbing into their hair, whispering broken prayers of gratitude over and over. Around them, passengers poured from the plane in a daze, some dropping to their knees to kiss the ground, others hugging strangers they would never see again, a few looking back at the boys with stunned, reverent expressions, as if seeing something holy. And then came the moment Jayden would remember for the rest of his life. Richard Sterling, the billionaire businessman who had flown unnoticed among them, pushed through the crowd, still in his rumpled suit, his expensive shoes caked in mud, and dropped to one knee in front of Jayden and Malik, removing his cap in a gesture of pure, unfiltered respect. His voice rough with emotion as he said, "The world doesn't deserve kids like you, but we damn sure need you." And without hesitation, in front of the flashing cameras and gasping onlookers, he pulled out a gold fountain pen from his jacket and signed a handwritten pledge right there on the hood of a fire engine, pledging full academic scholarships for both Jayden and Malik, covering every penny from now until they earned their pilot's licenses, if that's what they wanted, and offering Monique a senior management position at one of his companies in Los Angeles. With full benefits, real security, real hope. The crowd erupted into cheers, reporters shouting questions, microphones shoved forward, but Jayden barely heard any of it over the roar of his own heart, the sudden, dizzying rush of possibility unfolding in front of him like a sunrise after a decade of darkness. Tears streamed down Monique's face as she hugged her sons tighter, disbelief and joy warring in her eyes, and Malik just kept laughing and crying at the same time, unable to stop grinning. Later, after the interviews, after the endless questions and the blinking of police lights and the warm, grateful words from every single passenger, Jayden found a quiet moment, sitting on the edge of an ambulance bumper with Malik dozing against his shoulder, their mother finally able to breathe without fear for the first time in years. He looked up at the sky, the endless blue stretching far beyond the broken clouds, and felt a deep, powerful certainty settle into his bones. They had crossed the line between surviving and truly living. They had changed not only their fate, but the fate of everyone who had been blessed to fly with them that day. In the distance, the broken plane sat quiet now, its metal skin scorched and scarred, but alive, just like them. A monument to the impossible courage of two boys from the broken streets of Atlanta who had refused to let the world decide how high they could soar. The months that followed were a whirlwind, a blur of television interviews, award ceremonies, invitations to gala dinners where Jayden and Malik sat in stiff tuxedos under chandeliers they had only seen in movies, smiling nervously as generals, governors, and celebrities shook their hands calling them heroes, calling them the future. But no ceremony, no glittering medal compared to the quiet victories that mattered most. The day Monique Carter walked into her new job at Sterling Enterprises, head held high, not as someone cleaning floors in the dead of night, but as a respected coordinator with an office of her own, finally able to breathe without the constant weight of overdue bills crushing her chest. They moved into a small but bright apartment in a safe neighborhood outside Los Angeles, A place where Malik could ride his bike without fear, and Jaden could look up at the night sky without hearing gunshots in the distance. School came next, but not just any school. A private academy, fully funded by the scholarship Sterling had signed with his own hand, where Jaden found himself sitting in real flight simulators now, guided by real instructors who, far from dismissing him, listened with open awe to the boy who had already flown a crippled jetliner through hell and brought it home. Malik, never one to be left behind, found his own passion in mechanical engineering, tearing apart engines and rebuilding them better, dreaming not just of flying planes, but maybe designing them someday. Their names became etched in history books, studied in classrooms, whispered in neighborhoods like the one they came from. Proof that sometimes, just sometimes, the world could recognize greatness, no matter where it was born. Jaden never let it go to his head. He stayed hungry, stayed humble, driven by the same fierce fire that had pulled him into that cockpit when everyone else froze. Years later, on a warm spring day, thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, Jaden Carter, older now, taller, sharper, dressed in a crisp American Skies captain's uniform, with real gold wings pinned over his heart, stood at the helm of Flight 781, bound once again for Los Angeles, but this time with no chaos, no storm, no fear. The boarding completed smoothly. The cabin crew moved with practiced grace, and among the passengers settling into their seats was Monique Carter herself, hair touched with silver, eyes still burning with pride, and Malik, now a young man, grinning as he buckled into the window seat, snapping a mock salute toward his brother up front. Jaden smiled beneath his captain's cap, keyed the intercom, and spoke in a voice steady and proud, a voice that carried all the weight of the journey behind him and all the promise of the sky ahead. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard." And as he pulled back the yoke and the great bird lifted into the open sky, soaring higher and higher, Jaden knew he was no longer just flying a plane. He was flying a destiny that no one could ever take from him, carrying not just himself, but every dream, every sacrifice, every ounce of belief that had brought him from the cracked sidewalks of Atlanta to the endless, open heavens above.